joining us today. My name is Stacy Huff, and I am the president of the Louisville Forum. We meet on the second Wednesday of every month here at Vincenzo's Restaurant. The Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group founded in 1984. The Forum hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. Although we may take up issues that have a national interest, we try to highlight the local perspective. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our programs, or to make reservations, please visit our website, louisvilleforum.org. Our topic for today. While we were originally scheduled to host the Kentucky Attorney General debate between Greg Stumbo and Daniel Cameron, Mr. Stumbo had to cancel late yesterday as he had to attend a funeral of a good friend. Therefore, today's topic has been revised to Conversation with Cameron. We once again have asked veteran journalist and Louisville Forum board member Joe Arnold to moderate today's program, given his many years at WHAS-TV, where he served as their political editor. Joe is now Vice President of Strategic Communications for Kentucky Electric Cooperatives. Please welcome Joe Arnold.
Thank you. It's a mouthful. Thank you, Stacey. I also am a part-time podium holder, so that's my big job. No, thank you for being here. I want to thank Daniel Cameron for agreeing to continue to speak, and again, our regrets for not being able to bring you the debate that we have been promoting since last week. Again, as everyone knows, the race is for Attorney General. The Democratic candidate is Greg Stumbo, the former Attorney General and former Speaker of the House of the Kentucky General Assembly, of the Kentucky House of Representatives, and again, he sends his regrets that he was not able to take part in today's conversation, which has been shifted, as Stacey said, from a debate to a conversation with the Republican candidate, Daniel Cameron. Mr. Cameron is the Republican nominee for Attorney General, grew up in Hardin County, graduated from John Hardin Memorial High School in 2004, undergrad at the University of Louisville, and while there, played on the football team and also was a McConnell Scholar. He stayed at U of L after his undergrad and got his law degree there, the Brandeis School of Law. During his 3 years there, member of the Law Review and president of the Student Bar Association. In fact, he was named the law school's most outstanding student and a commencement speaker for graduation there as well. Passed the bar in 2011, has been licensed since October of that year. His professional career has consisted of serving as a law clerk in the U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of Kentucky, private practice at Stites and Harbison, service as Senator Mitch McConnell's legal counsel in Washington, and a return to private practice at Frost Brown Todd here in Louisville, where you have been since June of 2017. So with that, we will turn it over to Mr. Cameron for some opening remarks. Appreciate that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all. Well, thank you all so much, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say, just take a moment to acknowledge and honor those who lost their lives on 9/11. This country was in a period after 9/11 of great sorrow, and it's a sober reminder every 9/11 of the challenges that the country continues to face in terms of terrorism and those that we lost. So I'm honored to be here today and just wanted to make that quick acknowledgement. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the Louisville Forum. Joe, I appreciate the introduction. Stacy, where's Stacy now? We served together on Leadership Louisville for a period of time, so thank you as well for your part in today's forum too. As Joe noted, I'm from E-Town. I'm from Elizabethtown, Kentucky. I grew up there. My parents owned a small business in E-Town. It was a coffee shop. I often tell them that they were a little bit ahead of the Starbucks craze, but it was a good experience for them. It was open for about 16 years, and I worked there in the summers. It was really a cross-section of the community that we served, and so it was really a fun, great experience to work there. I was on the ball fields and in church all the time, and then graduated from John Hardin High School and went to the University of Louisville. I feel like that's a pretty safe comment to make here, right in the backyard of the university. I did play a little bit of football there. Play is a very generous term. I spent a lot of time on the bench rooting for other people that were much more talented than I was, but it was a great experience. At that time, we won the Liberty Bowl, we went to the Gator Bowl, and won the Orange Bowl, which was the pinnacle of the program at that time. After undergrad, I stayed at U of L and attended law school. Had an opportunity to be a member of the Law Review and president of the Student Bar Association. Really enjoyed my time at Brandeis and grateful for the opportunities they presented to me at the law school. After law school, I went and clerked for Greg Van Tatenhove, a federal judge over at that time in London, Kentucky. His chambers were there. His chambers are now in Frankfurt. Actually, but it was a unique experience, and obviously you sort of fine-tune your understanding of the law and your interpretation of contracts and statutes and what have you, so I really valued that experience. After that, I came back and worked at Stites and Harbison here in Louisville and did a lot of work in the Financial Institutions Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Fair Credit Reporting Act, and other financial matters. I then got a call from Senator McConnell in November of 2014 after he'd won his re-elect, asking me to go to D.C. to be his general counsel. I'd actually gotten to know him when I was a McConnell Scholar in undergrad and developed a very strong relationship with him that I continue to this day. But he asked me to go up, and I prayed about it and ultimately made the determination to go up end of February, beginning of March of 2015, and it was a transformative experience. I was there and helped the senator confirm Neil Gorsuch to the United States Supreme Court, in addition to other judicial nominees in the Sixth Circuit. In addition to that, I also worked very closely with Kentucky law enforcement, which is why, in many ways, I think I'm sitting here with you today. I was the liaison, if you will, between Senator McConnell's office and the law enforcement community back home. So I became intimately familiar with the challenges that they've had to confront. And so I worked closely with them to bring in additional dollars through the Office of National Drug Control Policy to help with our drug interdiction efforts here in Kentucky. And so I was very proud of that opportunity. I came back in June of 2017. I've been working at Frost Brown Todd. Had an opportunity to serve on the governor's Criminal Justice Reform PAC. I saw Judge Cunningham in here. I think we sat on a panel together working on reentry efforts. So I was proud of that experience, but in addition to that, I wanted to continue to be a meaningful contributor to the conversation around the drug epidemic. And for my judgment, one of the best ways to do that is in the Attorney General's office. I think this is the ultimate source of action in the critical office in terms of confronting what has become the public safety challenge of our lifetime, and that is the drug epidemic. And I've looked at the way that the office has been run over the last 3.5 years. In many ways, I think it's lost its way in terms of its responsibility to be the chief law enforcement office here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and advocating and working closely with our commonwealths and county attorneys, and working closely with our law enforcement community more broadly. And so that's what I intend to do in terms of the Attorney General's office, reestablish the credibility of the office as the chief law enforcement office. I think over the last few years, what we've seen more or less is AG's office that's been really interested in what's going on in the legislature. I think this office should be out in all 120 counties and asking the critical question, how can this office be helpful? That is how I've tried to campaign. I've been all over the state trying to make sure that people know what my values are and what my responsibilities, I believe, are in terms of the Attorney General's office. I also think that it's important that the Attorney General enforce and defend the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. That's what I intend to do as well. So I thank you all for the opportunity to sit before you and answer your questions, and look forward to the conversation. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Daniel. And again, he mentioned answer your questions. And so there, at each of your seats, at every table, there are question blanks there. We encourage you to fill out those questions. In a moment, Judge Jim Shake, who is now standing, thank you, Judge, as well as Nicole Gates, two of our Louisville Forum board members, will come around and gather those questions from you, and then from the rear of the house here, they'll represent them to Mr. Cameron. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and ask some questions for you, okay? You mentioned, first of all, some changes that you would want to do. So one thing, actually, I'm former news guy, so I'm always thinking about what's in the headlines right now. Just this week, Governor Bevin instructed his legal team to join 19 other states filing a brief in support of North Carolina's 20-week abortion ban currently before the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Fourth Circuit. And the governor says he took the action because the current Attorney General, Andy Beshear, refused to take part in that filing related to that particular law. So what is your view in general of a governor instructing a legal team and not the Attorney General to do that, and specifically about that case?
Well, let me just start by saying I think, and I've known Andy for a long time. We worked together at Stites and Harbison, but we just have a philosophically different view about what the responsibility of the Attorney General's office is. I think your responsibility is to defend and enforce the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. In this question in particular, I think it's the responsibility of the Attorney General to be active in these sorts of matters. But the reason that the governor's office has had to step in time and time again is because of whether it's to placate some of those in his very far liberal base, or because he wanted to use the office of Attorney General to give him a platform for which to run for governor. I think General Beshear has decided to either not defend or completely sit on the sidelines. I think you need an active and proactive Attorney General that is going to be a part of every conversation in terms of the policy decisions that are made. We have a responsibility, an obligation to enforce and defend the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. I take that commitment very seriously. When you stand up and take the oath of Attorney General, you make the commitment to be the enforcer and defender of the laws of the General Assembly. So I think the governor's office would probably look forward to having an Attorney General that sees that as his responsibility, defending and enforcing the laws. I think that'll alleviate some of the strain on the General Counsel's office in the governor's office if we get back in the Attorney General's office of doing the work of the people.
Speaking of which, the previous Attorney General before Andy Beshear, Jack Conway, was also involved in a case where he declined to defend a Kentucky law because of his thoughts were both legally and personally against that law. Are you suggesting that you would defend a Kentucky law that you personally did not agree with?
I think, look, in many ways, the office of Attorney General should be depoliticized. When it comes to the public safety challenges that we have in Kentucky, there's no Republican designation by them. There's no Democratic designation by them. I think when you hold up your hand to be the Attorney General, you hold up your hand to enforce and defend the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. So I look forward to being able to do that. Obviously, when you go into the office, you make an independent review of each piece of legislation that comes out of that prestigious body. But I think that's an appropriate thing to do, is to defend the laws that are passed. And so that's ultimately what I'm going to do.
You mentioned a party. Does anyone in this room know who Eldon Dummett is? Eldon Dummett. You know who Eldon Dummett is? Eldon Dummett was the last Republican to serve as Attorney General of Kentucky.
I'm very familiar. 1948, in fact.
That's right. Yeah. From 1944 to 1948. Yep. There have been 16 Democrats since then. Only 4 Republicans have served as Attorney General in the 200-plus year of Kentucky. So, after all that time, is Kentucky ready for a Republican Attorney General, and why?
Look, I think Kentucky is ready for an Attorney General that thinks that this is a job worth having, and it's a job worth having for more than just 3.5 years. The last 3 consecutive Attorney Generals have all been looking for different pastures. I don't use the comment greener pastures because I think that this job is important. The responsibilities that come across the Attorney General's desk are very important, and it's imperative that you have somebody that wants to do this job. Look, I have no interest in any other job. I've worked closely with the law enforcement community. I think any skill set that I have is connected to this community. So I look forward to providing and bringing continuity and stability to the office of Attorney General. I think folks in Kentucky are ready for somebody that is not looking to spend all their time in Frankfort and suing the General Assembly, that's looking for an Attorney General that's going to be out in all 120 counties, and as I noted earlier, asking the critical question, how can this office be helpful to our Commonwealth's attorneys, to our county attorneys, to our law enforcement community? Look, there's no, the law enforcement community has gotten behind this campaign because they know the strength of relationships that I have with them. I was up at the prosecutors conference a few weeks ago. I was the only Attorney General candidate to be at the prosecutors conference in Northern Kentucky. I was at the Kentucky Narcotics Officers Association training last week. I was the only Attorney General candidate to be at that training. It's because I believe that they need someone in this office that's going to be working for their interest. And I really don't think it has much to do with party affiliation. As I noted earlier, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter in terms of the public safety challenges that we have here in Kentucky. There's an incredible drug epidemic that we have here. We need somebody in this office that looks at the job to be the tip of the spear in terms of confronting this challenge, and that's ultimately what I'm going to do.
Let's get right to the questions if we could. I know that Jim Shake and Nicole Yates are toward the back, and if you guys could go ahead and start with the first question.
believe this is for candidate Cameron. Do you have any ideas specifically of the current litigation that is pending or been brought by Bashir that you would either drop or change in any way? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I think it's important for the next Attorney General, when if I'm fortunate on November 5th to win the election, is take an independent review of all that litigation. Obviously, because of the drug epidemic that we have here, we're going to continue to fight very forcefully on behalf of Kentuckians to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable, to hold drug traffickers accountable, working closely with our federal and state law enforcement community. So we're going to do the right things by that office. But in terms of the shift, in terms of making sure the mindset is changed from that of being a chief legislative officer or a chief policy officer, we're going to make sure that this office renews its promise as a chief law enforcement office in the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Nicole?
You were recently endorsed by President Trump. Did you vote for him? Why or why not?
I did. And, look, I am a Republican, and he was the nominee of our party. I've been proud of what President Trump has done in terms of fighting against some of the more radical views in this country. And I think, look, I'm an African American. The unemployment numbers for African Americans are lower than they've ever been before. So I'm proud of that fact. I was endorsed by him. I sat with him in the Oval Office for 35 minutes, had a great conversation with him. He was very interested in the challenges that we have here in Kentucky. He wanted to know where I stood on the sanctity of life, wanted to know where I stood on a whole host of issues. And so I'm proud to have that endorsement. Jim?
Our governor has voiced displeasure with the Attorney General and suggested that he should be allowed to pick his own, as President Trump is able to do. If elected, would you consider your role as a member of the governor's team or a member of the Constitution's team?
I'm a member of the Constitution's team. Look, we're all independently elected. And so my responsibility is to Kentucky's Constitution and to the United States Constitution. That's how I see the job. I will enforce the law without fear or favor. I have a responsibility to the men, women, and children of all 120 counties here in the Commonwealth, and that's how I'll approach the job.
What about your relationship with the governor overall? You were asked about President Trump. How would you describe that? And do you align yourself with the priorities of his administration, or are those a separate track?
I have a good relationship with the governor. I've had a good relationship with General Bashir as well. Look, it doesn't matter who's in the governor's mansion for me. What matters is enforcing and defending the laws that are passed by the General Assembly, and then ultimately being the chief law enforcement officer and working with our law enforcement community. And so that's the mission that when I got in this race on January 22nd, I found as the great responsibility that I think was lacking in the last 3.5 years, and ultimately why I got in this race, and look forward to leading this office over the next decade.
Nicole.
The Kentucky Constitution requires the Attorney General to have been a practicing attorney for 8 years. Do you meet that requirement? Did you practice law as a clerk in federal court?
I did. The way the Constitution reads here in Kentucky is that you have to have been a practicing lawyer 8 years prior to the election for which you're running. I meet that threshold in October of this year. And I have been practicing for 8 years. Look, I don't think anybody looks at me or looks at Mr. Stumbo and thinks that he would be a better representative for the Commonwealth of Kentucky than I would. I think the fact of the matter is that I've worked for 2 large law firms. I've worked at Stites and Harbison. I've worked at Frost Brown Todd. I've been the Majority Leader's General Counsel. I've been a federal law clerk. Those are all, which is not an easy opportunity to come by. Those are all great opportunities. I've tried to take advantage of them. I have full confidence in my ability to lead the Attorney General's office. I have full confidence in my ability to litigate on behalf of the men, women, and children of all 120 counties. And the law enforcement community has full confidence in my ability to lead this office and reestablish its credibility. So I'm grateful for that question.
Is there, before we go back to Judge Shake, is there any advantage that you see as far as your youthfulness, if you will?
Well, I think if you've seen my social media post, if you've paid attention at all to this campaign, I think it appears who's working the hardest in terms of this Attorney General's race. I've been all over the Commonwealth. I've been in Union County, I've been in Pike County, I've been Northern Kentucky, I've been in Southern Kentucky, trying to make what I believe very compelling argument that this office needs to return itself to its role as the chief law enforcement office. I think that argument has been resonating with Kentuckians. I think they're tired of the political fights of the past and how that office has operated in the past, whether it be General Stumbo during his time in the Attorney General's office, or what he brought to the table when he was Speaker of the House and funding his own pension, but yet letting teachers' pensions languish. And now we have the worst teachers' pensions here in Kentucky, but yet politicians' pensions are in good standing and fully funded. So I think they're tired of the political games of the past and want somebody that's going to look boldly into the future and look boldly into the future as it relates to the Attorney General's office and make sure that there's continuity and stability to this office over the next decade.
I do have one more question before I turn it over to our questioners. You mentioned the pension system. Recently, the pension system was in the news related to the Attorney General because of laws regarding transparency. And the Kentucky retirement systems, perhaps, and the auditor's report on their transparency and open government laws did not meet the standards, according to the auditor, at least, in that regard. So if you could maybe speak about that specifically, but also your take on the balance that there is and concerns of people who work for state government and their privacy concerns, or the privacy interests of, let's say, a private business who does business with the government versus the public's right to know, and why these open government and open records laws exist in the first place.
Well, we're going to be very diligent in terms of reviewing our open records laws and making sure that we're as transparent as possible in the Attorney General's office. I just make note of the fact that General Bashir just recently had a contract that he had entered into with Morgan & Morgan, had that contract essentially rescinded because of transparency concerns. So we're going to be very transparent in the Attorney General's office. I know Auditor Harmon very well and look forward to working with him and all of our statewide elected officials to make sure that transparency is paramount in terms of our responsibility to the people here in Kentucky.
Do you foresee any changes, amplifications, reductions in the way the law is currently applied?
Well, I talk to people all across the Commonwealth, county officials and what have you, and so we'll make an independent review of that if I'm fortunate to get in the office after November 5th.
Jim?
These next two questions are sort of related, so I'm going to ask them at the same time. First is that you mentioned enforcement of legislation is not part of the role of the Attorney General to make sure that such legislation is constitutional. And secondly, our last two Kentucky Attorneys General have at times refused to defend the constitutionality of Kentucky statutes. Under what circumstances might the Attorney General justify refusing to defend Kentucky's laws in court?
Well, look, I've made the commitment that I think when you take the oath, you take the obligation to enforce and defend the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. But my ultimate responsibility is to the Constitution of Kentucky and the United States Constitution. And so we will obviously make independent assessments of every piece of litigation that comes before us, whether that's advice prior to any legislation passing or after the fact when we are asked to defend it.
Nicole?
African Americans are 6 times more likely to be cited for possession of marijuana than Caucasians. Will you support County Attorney Mike O'Connell's decision not to prosecute marijuana possession cases?
I think we have a responsibility as law enforcement officials to enforce our laws here, and so that includes the laws that we have here on marijuana. What I will say, though, is that, and Judge Cunningham is aware of this, when I came back to the Commonwealth, I've been a participant in the criminal justice reform conversations that we've had here in Kentucky. I've been really interested in the reentry component. I think we need to, once people have served their prison sentence, we need to allow them to reintegrate into society in a meaningful way so that they can be productive citizens. So I look forward to working with folks all across the spectrum in continuing the conversation on criminal justice reform here in the Commonwealth.
Jim?
All right, this is a two-part question. One is, where is your fundraising coming from? And secondly, how will you handle the drug company litigation?
Well, I'll take the first one, or second one. We're going to prosecute pharmaceutical companies, drug traffickers, whomever is pushing poison into the Commonwealth. Make no mistake about that. And fundraising, we've been really pleased with the fundraising that we have here, and it's coming from Kentuckians and all sorts of places. So really excited about where we are in terms of our fundraising, and I think that talks about a lot of the energy that's behind this campaign, and so really excited about that.
Nicole?
A Republican AG PAC is running ads against Greg Stumbo. That PAC has accepted contributions from Purdue Pharma, a leading distribution manufacturer of OxyContin. Will you reject the support from this group based on what that drug has done to our Commonwealth?
Well, I have no coordination with these outside groups is the first thing. The other thing that I'll say is that I'll just allude back to the answer that I just gave. Without fear or favor, we are going to prosecute matters against any pharmaceutical company and hold them accountable for anything that they've done as a bad actor here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. That is my position. That won't change regardless of who gets involved in this campaign or decides to sit out this campaign. And so that is my commitment to you all. That's the commitment that I've made to the law enforcement community. There's a reason that they are supporting this campaign. It's because they recognize and respect my ability to lead the Office of Attorney General, especially as it relates to its position of being the chief law enforcement office here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
If I could, as a follow-up on the pharmaceutical question, there have been previous attorneys general who were entered into either settlements or other legal cases dealing with that. Are you in disagreement with any of the actions that the previous attorneys general took?
Well, let me just say this. There is a sitting Democratic attorney general here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that got $24 million in a settlement from Purdue Pharma. You go out to Oklahoma, where Mike Hunter, who is the Republican attorney general, just prosecuted the case against Johnson & Johnson and got over $500 million. So you tell me who's in a better position to litigate the matters against the pharmaceutical company. Somebody that got $24 million, the Democratic AG, or the Republican AG that got over $500 million. I'm going to stand with Mike Hunter and others, Republican attorney generals and other well-meaning attorney generals across the country to make sure that we get as much as we can for these companies that have been pumping poison into the Commonwealth. So I look forward to being able to do that.
One final follow-up on that then. Are you suggesting that if you had been the attorney general and not Andy Beshear, that you would have been able to secure a larger settlement than what he got?
That $24 million is a paltry sum, especially in light of the fact that you look what Johnson & Johnson just had to render in a judgment in Oklahoma. That was over $500 million. I think we were disserved by that number that came out of the Purdue Pharma settlement. And I certainly would have hoped that I could have been in a better position to leverage and get a better settlement than the $24 million that we got.
Jim?
This may take the rest of our time, but what has been the biggest challenge of your campaign?
The biggest challenge of the campaign is, the Commonwealth is 120 counties. And so getting to every place and making sure that people have an opportunity to have conversations with you and know what your campaign represents and what you are for and what you're against and how you can help improve the public safety outcomes here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. That's the largest challenge. There are events every day that you can go to, and obviously I made a choice to be here today with you all because I think it was an important thing to do, to be in front of you and have a conversation about my vision. But you can spend your time however you think, and so I've tried to get in front of as many people as possible, but it's not easy. But it's worth it. The reward of having some meaningful impact in the Attorney General's office, if I'm fortunate to win on November 5th, will be greater than all the travel and trying to get to every nook and cranny here in the Commonwealth.
Our broadcasts of the Louisville Forum are shown on Metro TV for those folks just tuning in or anyone who walked in after we began. This was originally scheduled to be a debate between the Democratic candidate Greg Stumbo and the Republican candidate Daniel Cameron. We heard late yesterday afternoon from the Democratic candidate, Mr. Stumbo, that he was unable to attend because of a funeral of a friend. And so we have transitioned from a debate to a conversation with the Republican candidate. We appreciate him taking part in that. Second follow-up for the people who are in attendance here. I knew that there was a flurry of questions, I know, at the very beginning. We still have time between now and the next half an hour for more of your questions. If you've heard something that needs perhaps a follow-up, please be sure to let us know about that. After Nicole asks the next question, we can be sure to collect those and get those to our questioners in the back. Nicole Yates.
All right. This is a two-part question.
I'll give a two-part answer, maybe.
During the primary, your ad said words to the effect that you were going to clean out the office of the AG. Since you have never tried a case in civil or criminal, or never prosecuted case, why are you more qualified than Greg Stumbo to effectively run the office of AG?
Well, I think I just talked about this a little bit earlier. Again, I don't think anybody looks at me and looks at Mr. Stumbo and thinks that he'd be a better representative for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I've talked to folks all across Kentucky, whether it be Republican or Democrat, that are just tired of his brand of politics, tired of the way that he operated, whether it be in the Attorney General's office or as his time as Speaker of the House. In fact, we don't have to go back that far into the distant past to know that in 2016, when he was running for re-election as Speaker of the House, he lost in his own district because his values had become inconsistent with that district. So it's not just me saying that I would be a better person to lead the Attorney General's office. It was his district in 2016. I think other folks that have known him and the way that he's operated in Frankfort recognize that I would be a better Attorney General as well, that I would bring people into the office that would be able to help on a whole host of challenges that we have, and that I'd be a good leader for the law enforcement community.
Jim?
Vaping is a big issue these days. Have you given thought of how your office would handle the vaping crisis?
Well, we certainly don't want minors using these vaping instruments. I was just reading a report the other day that there are now sort of health complications and concerns that arise with the use of vaping. But that'll be something that we look more in depth into once I get in the AG's office.
Nicole?
I keep disappearing because I'm eating my lunch back here. You have a few scenarios that could play out, but there is some chance you have a governor of the other party. How do you see the role of AG as being either a partner of or a check on the governor, regardless of the party affiliation?
It does not matter to me, and I think I mentioned this earlier, who ultimately gets in the governor's mansion. I know Governor Bevin. I know Andy Beshear well as also. I think ultimately I have a responsibility to the men, women, and children of all 120 counties here as it relates to the Attorney General's office, and I will work with whomever is in the governor's office. I'll work with whomever, whether you have an R designation or a D designation by your name. The public safety challenges that we have here are too large to pick and choose based on party affiliation who I'm going to work with. I'm proud of the fact that law enforcement community, commonwealths, and county attorneys, whether they have a D or R by their name, have supported this campaign, and that's how I intend to govern the Office of Attorney General.
Follow up again.
Yes, sir.
It's my discretion. I love this role. Speaking of which, as far as being perhaps a check on the governor's office, both Attorney General at the time, Stumbo, and the current Attorney General Beshear have in fact gone to court numerous times, or did go to court numerous times, against the governors that they served alongside, if you will, or at the same time. Do you think that either Attorney General Andy Beshear or Attorney General Greg Stumbo stepped over the line at any point in terms of the legal cases that they brought against their respective administrations?
Well, let me just say this. What was the motive that undergirded those decisions that were made by General Stumbo and General Beshear? I think it was more or less for their own political advancement. You had two attorney generals that you just noted who have decided that after 3.5 years that they want to run for another office. When Greg Stumbo was in this office from 2003 to 2007, he now talks about wanting to finish the job that he started then. Well, why didn't he run for re-election in 2007 to the Attorney General's office if he was so interested in being the Attorney General, in fighting the pharmaceutical companies, in fighting against the drug epidemic? It's because he did not think enough of this office. He thought that running for Lieutenant Governor was more important than staying and remaining the Attorney General. Same thing with General Beshear. He doesn't find this job satisfactory. He doesn't find the job challenging enough to stay in this office. He's looking for a different platform. Again, I think this office needs continuity and stability over the next decade, and I intend to bring that over the 8 years. I'm hopeful if I can get through this first hurdle in November. So.
Begging your indulgence, did either of them step over the line?
I think, again, they were running for another office, and they found it to their advantage and advantageous to do things that allowed them an opportunity to garner attention and a platform for which to run for governor.
Jim?
This question says, given what you've said earlier today, is it correct that you are unequivocally supportive of repealing Roe versus Wade, thereby assuring that women do not have control over their own bodies?
Say that last part again. I'm sorry, I was drinking water.
It's that you're supportive of repealing Roe versus Wade, thereby assuring that women do not have control over their own bodies.
Well, I'm supportive of defending the Constitution and Kentucky's Constitution. And I believe that the responsibility of the Attorney General is to enforce and defend the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. That is my ultimate responsibility as Attorney General, and that's what I will do.
Nicole?
Okay, so 2 questions here, but kind of go together. So the General Assembly will never be controlled by the party. You stated it is the role of the Attorney General to defend the laws passed by the General Assembly. Would you defend laws passed by the General Assembly limiting access to firearms? And also, if the legislation and governor sign into law that you know is unconstitutional, are you going to defend those laws?
Well, I'm going to defend the Constitution here in Kentucky, the United States Constitution. We'll obviously make an independent assessment of every piece of legislation prior to its passing. I know sometimes AGs are asked for their advice on pieces of legislation, and we'll also make an independent review after the fact. But I do believe that the responsibility, with respect to whoever is in the governor's office, that I have a responsibility and role to defend those laws that are passed by the General Assembly. But we will make an independent review and assessment of those matters as they come up.
Jim?
What is your view of Kim Davis's refusal to issue marriage licenses to gay applicants?
Well, I think that, look, I was just with a group a couple of weeks ago, the Hands On Originals T-shirts people, and I fully stand with those that want to express their deeply held religious beliefs, and I don't shy away from that. And so I think that what the Lexington Human Rights Commission decided against that Hands On Originals case, I think that stepped over the line. I think it's important that people in this country, in many ways this country was founded on the idea that there is a religious freedom here. And so your ability to freely associate and freely exercise that religious freedom is important to me.
So that was a private business and Hands On Originals, a public official in Kim Davis as a county clerk in Rowan County.
Well,
what's the difference?
I think ultimately her plight, her issue was just signing the marriage license, and I think ultimately they've gotten that resolved. But we're going to stand up for religious freedom here, the Commonwealth. I think that's consistent with the values that we hold here in Kentucky, and I certainly am going to do that.
Nicole?
What activities, if any, would you undertake as Attorney General to implement criminal justice reform at the state level?
Well, I think it's important that this continue as a conversation that we have here in Kentucky. As I noted earlier, I sat on the committee that the governor implemented a few years ago to talk about criminal justice reforms here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I'm certainly still committed to being a part of that discussion and utilizing whatever resources we can in the Attorney General's office to help in that conversation. I think it's important that we look at our prison population and look for ways. We're now challenged with a lot of overcrowding concerns. I think it's important that the Attorney General, along with John Tilley, who's the Secretary of the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet, be a part of that conversation as well, and in addition to Commissioner Sanders over the Kentucky State Police and the Department of Corrections and their staff as well, to look at ways, meaningful ways, that we can reduce our prison population.
Jim?
This questioner wants to know, what was the most important or impactful piece of legislation that Senator McConnell crafted and shepherded to passage while you were there? And they don't want to talk about legislation that he blocked or a nomination that he got through.
So what I will say is probably most impactful to here in the Commonwealth was a piece of legislation, excuse me, that we worked on called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, CARA for short. All across the country, I think folks have started to recognize that the drug epidemic is something that has impacted and touched so many families, and that piece of legislation, CARA, was in direct response to that epidemic. Getting more Narcan available to law enforcement community and healthcare providers to make sure that people have a chance to live again if they've gone into an overdose, making sure that there are resources in communities all across the country that allow for treatment and rehabilitation. So that was a piece of meaningful legislation that I think has had a strong impact on our drug epidemic that we have here in the Commonwealth and across the country.
Nicole?
All right. Someone wrote, I am unclear on your answer. Do you believe that Roe versus Wade should be repealed?
I think Roe versus Wade will have to be taken up by the United States Supreme Court. They will ultimately make the decision. Personally, I think that, I'm 100% pro-life, and so I would, be in a position of wanting to see, Roe versus Wade looked at by the Supreme Court, and they will ultimately make that determination.
Let me ask a question I have on my list as well about, you talked before about laws that people choose to follow and laws we choose not to, or even from official standpoints. Immigration, we had a panel here within the last year on so-called sanctuary cities and basically cooperation with the federal government on immigration laws versus local constituencies or municipalities, governments, perhaps having a different take on that. As Attorney General, to what extent would you see it to it that federal law is followed, or do you think that those local governments should have the right to choose whether or not to cooperate with those laws?
Well, I think it's incredibly important that the person that sits behind this desk as Attorney General be a good partner to our state and federal law enforcement community. And so I think that means helping enforce our immigration policies that we have here in the United States. I contrast that with my opponent who, in 2013, when he was Speaker of the House, offered legislation that would have given driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, and then would have told our federal law enforcement community that they can't track those individuals. I think if you're running to be the chief law enforcement officer here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, you have to make a commitment to be a good partner to our state and federal law enforcement community. I think in many ways he's forfeited his opportunity to be the Attorney General because of that statement that he's made on the record in the past in terms of essentially defying federal immigration policies here. So I'm going to be supportive of our immigration and our ICE officials and our immigration policies here in the country, and we'll do everything I can to help those individuals.
Jim?
This questioner says, the tone set by the president and the governor is decidedly confrontational. Anyone who disagrees with them is insulted and belittled. Do you believe that this is the way governance should work?
Well, look, I try to, in my own campaign, function in a way that I want people to know that anyone, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with me, that I'm going to have a very civil conversation with them. And so I hope that I hope that's been demonstrated today. I imagine not everybody in this room is in 100% agreement or alignment with me, but yet the fact that I'm here having this conversation with you, I hope that gives me some credibility. So I have my part to play in the national dialogue and in our Commonwealth's dialogue, and I hope I'm being a good representative in terms of how I present myself.
Nicole?
All right, so we're going to kind of combine here. So since you believe that the AG is subordinate to the governor, how will you, if the governor is reelected, Governor Bevin is reelected, how will you challenge the governor's take on action that may not be legal regarding the Medicaid action?
Well, I respectfully reject the premise. I don't think this Office of Attorney General is subordinate in any way. We are independently elected. I will enforce the law without fear or favor. I have just as much as responsibility as the governor. I have just as much as responsibility as the Secretary of State to do that. And so that will ultimately be how I function. My responsibility is to the United States Constitution and to the Constitution of Kentucky. And so I will enforce the law without fear or favor. and will work diligently on every piece of legislation to make an independent assessment of where that ultimately, where we'll ultimately come down on that in terms of our responsibility to defend the laws here in Kentucky.
Jim.
Would you sue the next Democratic president's administration when it tries to enforce the Clean Air Act to slow climate change and reduce its threats to public health and safety?
Well, right now, I'll let you know that there is a piece of legislation, or I'm sorry, not a legislation, but President Trump has issued through the EPA a new, essentially, Clean Water Act that is called essentially it allows for states to have more control over our clean water determinations here in the country. And so I anticipate President Trump winning a re-election, but we're going to do whatever we can here to stand up. I was just down with coal miners in West Kentucky over in Union County last week, and they need someone in the AG's office that is going to stand up for their industry. And I think over the last AGs and the last presidential administration, those folks were looked down upon, and their industry was shut down because of the work that the prior administration did. So if something was to happen where we have a Democratic president who wants to try to shut down the coal mines again, then I'm going to ultimately stand up with our coal miners to fight against that.
Jim?
What advice has Senator McConnell given you, either financially or politically?
Well, I'm often given advice by the senator, by others, by my mother. I'm given a lot of advice. And so I think, just what I've been told is to be your authentic self and let people know where you stand on the issues. And I've ultimately tried to do that here on the campaign trail. I'm also trying to raise money. So if any of you all in this audience would like to give to our campaign, we'd certainly appreciate that.
Nicole?
Regarding reentry, do you support ending felony disenfranchisement and increasing the number of people who can qualify for expungement?
So what I'll say it sounds like it's restoration of voting rights. So I think what we, in this country folks' rights should be restored. I think it's a matter of how quickly that occurs. I think some period of time before the restoration occurs is appropriate, but obviously a conversation can be had about that. The other question about expungement, I'm certainly in the position of wanting folks, my mother works in prison ministry, and there are people that, for whatever circumstances, have found themselves in jail or in prison who need an opportunity, once they've done their period of service, to reacclimate and reintegrate into society. And so whatever ways that are possible to do that, whether expungement is part of that conversation or not, I'd certainly be willing to listen to it. I know we already have some pretty forward expungement laws here in the Commonwealth, and I think the legislature, I know I saw Senator McGarvey in here somewhere. I know they're always working to look more closely at how they can improve those expungement laws that we have here in Kentucky.
Jim?
Please describe your thoughts regarding tort reform in Kentucky.
Well, I think that tort reform is needed, and that's obviously a conversation that the General Assembly will have to have over the course of the next 4 years. But I do find that some version of tort reform is appropriate. I know healthcare providers always talk about the challenges that they have in attracting talent to the Commonwealth of Kentucky because of some of the concerns that they have about groups like Morgan & Morgan and others that sort of are operations that will come in and find reasons to sue our healthcare providers, making it more difficult to attract talent. So I think some tort reform is probably appropriate, but that's a conversation that the General Assembly will have to have.
Nicole?
There is a significant minority group in this state who don't particularly trust law enforcement. How do you plan to bridge that gap?
Well, I hope that come November 5th, I think they will see, hopefully, that if I win this election, that they'll see that this is a community that will embrace folks that look like me. And not just because I've won an election, but because I've built relationships with this community. And I certainly think that I bear a responsibility to lead the charge in helping improve those relationships, whether there's perceived issues or real issues. I think ultimately I have a responsibility to be out front and leading the charge in helping mend whatever fences need to be mended.
4 years ago, Janine Hampton became the first African-American Kentuckian elected to a statewide office. That was on a ticket with the governor. You would be the first African-American Kentuckian elected in a solo office, if you will. Does that, you already remarked upon that as far as that, but would you see that as a hallmark event in Kentucky history?
Well, look, I don't shrink from that fact. I recognize there is a historic component to this race, and certainly embrace and am willing to do my part in hopefully being a good representative of my community and the larger Kentucky community. I think it's really important to note that in the Republican primary, I won 104 of 120 counties because I think my message resonates. I think people want someone that sees the job as the chief law enforcement officer, and that was the message that I took to all 120 counties, and I think it was the right one, and I'm hopeful that it'll be the right one come November 5th.
Time for one more question each from Jim and Nicole.
All right, how would you argue that a progressive voter should give her vote to you?
Well, I certainly would welcome the vote. Look, I think if you're looking for new leadership, not a name of the past, not a relic of the past in terms of the Attorney General's office, in terms of offering new leadership, bold leadership, moving into the next decade to get the Attorney General's office moving again, I think you take a serious look at my candidacy and what I bring to the table. I'm not mired or bogged down by the political fights of the past. I'm my own voice and bring that into the Attorney General's office. I think if you want to see a return to the proper mission of the Attorney General's office as being the chief law enforcement officer, that you'll give this candidacy a look. Again, I've heard from Republicans and Democrats all across the Commonwealth who just cannot fathom giving another term to Mr. Stumbo because of the way that he operates, not operating in the sense that he's there for the men, women, and children of all 120 counties, but there for his own political advancement. Again, I will make note that he was Speaker of the House, been in government for 30-plus years, yet did nothing on the teachers' pension issues and challenges that we have here, but did find a way to fully fund his own pension. Do you want that brand of leadership in the Attorney General's office? I beg to differ that you do not. So I hope that you'd give my candidacy a serious look over the next couple of months, and hopefully I can earn the progressives' vote come November 5th.
Nicole.
So I believe you have answered this question. I will read
I'll
it.
answer it maybe.
I will read it and
yeah.
then give the balance of my time back to the moderator.
Okay.
In what ways do you plan to evolve the office of the Attorney General?
I'm sorry.
In what ways do you plan to evolve the office of the Attorney General?
Well, I'm actually, let me talk about a little bit of how I envision the Attorney General's office working. Obviously, there are three branches right now. There is the criminal branch, the civil branch, and the advocacy branch. I think General Bashir has changed that to the families branch. I think it's important to have some reform of the office, but my view of reform of the office is to expand the footprint of the Attorney General's office. So I think the further you move from the Golden Triangle, if you will, Louisville, Lexington, and Northern Kentucky, the more removed you feel from your state government. And so I think it's important to have a visible representation of the Attorney General's office outside the Golden Triangle. So I'm going to do my best within the first 100 days or what have you to get visible representation of the Attorney General's office in West Kentucky and in East Kentucky. The other thing that I've talked about and I announced a couple weeks ago was starting, in light of the drug epidemic, starting an Attorney General's Ambassador Program. So what that program would be is essentially having two individuals, volunteers, in all 120 counties who can either directly or indirectly talk about their experience with the drug epidemic. So that means going into our Rotary clubs, our other civically minded organizations, Louisville Forum, for instance, to talk about the challenges that come along with getting addicted to drugs and how it can change the trajectory of your life. So that's one meaningful thing that I want to do. Additionally, I want to increase the number of drug investigators that we have in the Attorney General's office. Again, we have a huge drug epidemic. I think right now there are 5 drug investigators in that office for 120 counties. I think that number needs to be plussed up. So I'm going to be working with our legislature, our General Assembly, to make sure I can get more from the budget. The other thing that I think I bring to the table in terms of my federal experience is helping bring additional dollars to the Commonwealth through the Office of National Drug Control Policy and other forms of revenue and resources, whether it be through the Burn JAG program, which is a law enforcement specific program. So there are meaningful ways that I think, starting on day one, that we can have a huge impact in terms of shifting the mindset of what the responsibility of the Attorney General is and what the priority should be as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer.
He may have preferred that his Democratic candidate appear rather than your questions. They were. Thank you for. Let's thank Daniel Cameron for appearing today in our conversation. Thank you. Thank you for your time. And Stacy, I'll turn this over to you.
All right, great, thank you. All right, and as Joe said, on behalf of the entire Louisville Forum, we do thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to be here. As an expression of our appreciation, we are going to make a contribution from a charity that Daniel selects from a list that the board put together earlier this year. Our next meeting will be held on Wednesday, October 9th, and the topic will address the issue of public events and public safety. Our panel of experts will provide insight on measures being taken to reduce the likelihood of such events occurring in Louisville, and will discuss what the general public can do to reduce their vulnerability while at large public events. Our panel will include the newly named Kentucky Derby Festival President Matt Gibson, as well as a retired Secret Service agent and a member of Louisville's emergency management team. So just give us a couple of days to update the website. We'll send out the email invites and update the voicemail, but you'll be able to register at louisvilleforum.org or call our number at 329-0111. Thanks and have a great day.